Hello everyone and welcome back to my not studio because I'm at home again. Today I'm going to be giving you an update on a writing project that I've been working on because I realised that in my first few videos, obviously I haven't had this channel for very long, but in my first few videos I mainly talk about my artwork, but at the minute I've been on a real, genuinely good writing sprint. And for the past month at least, it's where my focus has been rather than on my paintings, which are still in progress and it is something that I still work on. But because creatively I work in so many different mediums, I think it's quite nice to have a space where I can talk about writing, I can talk about painting, I can talk about illustration, and I can do all of those things and share with you every part of my creative life and career, and it's quite nice to feel. First of all, I should probably introduce you to my project a little bit because I haven't really talked about it online. Like, everybody in my immediate kind of friends and family know that I'm a writer as well as an artist, and it's something that I've always kind of pursued, but I've just never been able to commit the time or the energy or the focus to a long form project as much as I've wanted to. Whenever I've had the idea or felt like I really, really want to write this, it's been at a really bad time. It's, when it comes to writing and creating outside of a full-time job, it just doesn't really work very well. And I know a lot of people suffer through it for years to get writing projects on the ground, but I just haven't ever really had that hit for me. But this year I've been working on a writing project that I am really, really in love with, have been in love with for the past couple of years. So I started out kind of with the idea in my head, the vague idea of the characters, the same way that most other people come up with novels, books, and particular characters that they want to work on. So it started very loosely in my head and kind of developed from the research that I was doing during my master's degree, but I hadn't really connected the dots until very recently. And so I'll call it Project Willow. I know it's always nice to have a project title, and so this one, it links, don't worry. It's called Project Willow and it is a literary novel, and it's also a coming of age story. So it looks very closely at the growing up of this particular character that's the main focus of the book through a time where sexualization, misogyny and general patriarchal ideology is still very rife. So it's linked very closely to our time now, but it doesn't take place in modern day necessarily. And the thing that's been, I think, the most interesting for me is considering how the character would exist and interact with people in different situations, which I think when you're writing a story that leans very heavily into character development, that's where you want to go with it. You want to think very specifically about the kind of scenarios that you'll put your character in, and then as a person, how are they developing or unraveling in those particular situations. So that's been something that's been really fun for me. So I've been reading very particular types of novels in order to feed into the inspiration and to keep me very much in the same headspace. I haven't read a fantasy in a little while because I've been kind of putting all my reading attention into inspiration for my novel, which has been amazing. It's not been against my will. I've been enjoying doing it. It's been a while since I've just read in one genre for even a couple of months. So that's what I've been doing. And I wanted to share kind of the books that I've been reading as well, because I think that the way that they inspire me will link very heavily into the way that I'm writing. And each kind of author that I'm reading in at the minute lends something very different to my kind of experience as a writer as well. So I wanted to share that with you to give you an idea of how different books and how you research and read while you're writing can have such a different impact on how the story turns out. And also I'm very much a believer in doing your research while you write or while you paint. I talked in my last video about how important it is to look at art, to experience art, and to learn about art if you want to be an artist. I know that it's difficult for a lot of people to accept that you can't just put paint on a canvas without kind of any real understanding of why you're doing it, and it just is art. Like, that's not really how it works. Like, you can have a painting, but doing a painting doesn't necessarily make it a piece of art, and there are reasons for that, and a lot of that is development and skill and experience and what goes into it. And I think that, you know, we have kind of this aversion to learning at the minute. We want to believe that we can create something and it just comes out of us and it's immediately incredible, but that's just not how it works. Like, you have to develop as a creator, and you have to put work into developing your craft in order to create something beautiful and something meaningful. And that's all right. Like, you know, if you're just writing what comes into your head, it's a journal, right? Even if you change the names and maybe certain situations you haven't necessarily been in, but if you're just writing them without really doing any kind of work to put into it, it's a journal compared to a novel. And there's a big difference in the level of craft and the level of skill that you can put into a project when you do your research and you enjoy exploring it. You know, it's like putting words down on a piece of paper and calling it a poem doesn't make it a good poem. It just makes it like a little piece of writing that you've decided to create. And yeah, I think that because of that very social aversion to learning and developing, and this like real hold on the belief that just like I've created something, therefore it is a masterpiece, like that's just it. I think a lot of that comes from ego and this sense of like self-fulfillment and desire that we want to fulfill. And yeah, that's not the vibe that I feel like anybody should participate in. And if anybody kind of feels like hurt by hearing that they can't just write a novel and it will just be good, you know, that's just your ego talking, and you should keep that at bay a little bit. But anyway, so I want to keep coming on here and talking about my inspirations, because I think it's really important to hear from each other the work that we're doing and the experiences that we're putting into our own craft in order to, you know, show other people how important it is. And we need that from each other. So I have talked recently about some of the authors that inspire me, and I'm gonna talk more broadly on that now as well. In the past, when I've done bits of writing, or I've like been working on a particular project, I will kind of put myself into that genre and read from other authors in that genre and find the ones that I feel like are giving something to me and that I'm learning from, learning about their craft and how that might benefit my own learning journey as well. And there are some really incredible authors out there widely across genres that I feel like I've done their dues and that we should give them credit for that. And I particularly, as a writer that wants to write literary or contemporary fiction, there is such a breadth of incredible writing out there. So I want to spotlight a few that at the moment are lending incredible lessons to my writing process for this particular project, for Project Willow. So currently I'm on a real Sally Rooney binge. I read Normal People first, and it was actually, so when the TV series came out in 2020, I had put off watching it, not because I didn't want to see it, but because I was like, oh, that sounds like a book that I feel like I'd really enjoy. And then I just never got around to reading it, and I kept like seeing the show and being like, all right, I'm just gonna watch it. So I watched the TV show first, which is rare for me. I usually will pick up the book if I see a TV show that's an adaptation that I really wanna read, because I feel like you do have a different experience with a novel whether you watch the adaptation first or not. So I wanted to read it first, but I ended up watching it first, and I absolutely loved the show. It was incredibly made. It was absolutely fascinating to have such a, I think, a limited script and have so much atmosphere, action and circumstance play a role in the like over the episodes of the limited series, and I did immediately go and pick up the book straight after watching it. So I did read the book straight after, and then after reading Normal People, I read Conversations with Friends, and then Conversations with Friends, the TV series came out, and I did watch that. So I've loved Sally Rooney's books for a while, and I've probably even in the past couple of weeks just been really indulging in that world again, the worlds that she creates. So in the last 2 weeks alone, I've rewatched Normal People, I rewatched Conversations with Friends, I have been reading Beautiful World, Where Are You again for the second time, and I haven't read Intermezzo yet, but I do have the book, so I'm very much looking forward to reading that probably within the next week. And I think that what I get from Sally Rooney's work and why it's so inspiring to me at the minute while I'm in this like really writerly space is how beautifully she writes these characters and their internal worlds. I really love, obviously in Beautiful World in particular, the email relationship between Eileen and Alice is really, really wonderful. And I love reading these like small personal essays that they send each other. I think it's such a nice addition to a novel, and I've always loved experimental fiction or fiction that works with different formats. So like Dracula being one of my favourite novels because of its formatting, its diaries, its journals, its pieces of writing that like build the novel to a whole piece. That's something that I've always really enjoyed with reading novels, and I really like the way that Sally Rooney inserts these excerpts of emails and text messages and these online conversations into a narrative text. Sally Rooney is such a big part of my headspace right now because of the character development. So obviously with like Connell and Marianne, their youthful kind of experiences, that how that relationship developed over years is really nice. And then with Frances and her relationships with Bobby and Nick and Melissa, the way that really personal, intimate, kind of changing relationship between that particular group I find absolutely fascinating. I love the way that she writes about interactions between characters, and it really feeds into how my main character interacts with the people around her. So even though the format of my novel is different, I'm a more descriptive writer. I think I focus a lot on, not purple prose particularly, but there are a lot of elements of that. And I think it's because it's developed from me as a very young writer, being told at university during my creative writing modules that I needed to stop using adverbs. I was using a lot of adverbs and lots of like adjectives and every kind of descriptive word. I was just using it in multiple places in every sentence. It was pretty bad. But as much as I've developed as a writer and I don't do that as much, it's still a part of like how I like to write prose. So it's a little bit flowery, which I know that Sally Rooney doesn't necessarily engage with. Like her texts they're very insular and conversational and very wonderfully accessible to read as well. Okay, sorry, my camera stopped recording. Character work is really important to me as a writer at the minute as I'm developing Project Willow and the different character relationships in that. Everyone in her life is very much a side character for the main narrative. So it's really important to me as someone trying to develop a narrative and look at kind of self-obsession and that focus on oneself as you're growing from like a child into a young adult. The character relationships are really crucial to get right, and I'm very much relying on Sally Rooney's teachings in these beautiful novels to inspire me and to keep me in check as well, because that's something that's really important about reading, is that you're exposed to narratives that have been written and edited and worked on and made to be the best versions of themselves before they're put into your hands. And when you're writing on a project, it's such an early stage that reading as you're doing that can really help to manage the work that you're doing and manage the way that you're engaging with the narrative. That's very much something that I'm learning from Sally Rooney as I'm going, which is really, really wonderful. Another author that I am relying quite a lot on for character development and also the kind of insular narrative of main characters is Shirley Jackson, another author that just really inspires like a lot of my creative practice. So I read Shirley Jackson when I'm painting and when I'm working on a particular art piece because of the mood and the atmosphere that she creates. It really gets into my head and it fills me up. And because I like to paint slightly dark but also narrative paintings, she's a really fantastic influence to have for that. I've been reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is Jackson's last novel, and I very recently read her first novel, Hangsaman, and I have been reading her short stories for years. I studied a few of them on one of the modules during my master's degree, so I've always been really comfortable with her writing style. She also does have more descriptive narrative play than just like purely character focused work, which is really nice. I love her prose style, the way that she writes, the way that she engages the characters, but also builds really incredible atmosphere. And for me, as a writer that kind of slips quite comfortably into dialogue and then struggles not to have overly flowery descriptions, it's really great to have a writer on hand that is exceptional at building atmosphere and using dialogue only when is necessary. My characters are a lot more conversational, and probably by default, so I find it quite hard to kind of be like, okay, how can I use my writing to create an atmosphere for this character without overdoing it and without making it stereotypical. And Shirley Jackson is a very good teacher in how to build atmosphere and also engage with dialogue in suspenseful and crafty ways, in quite a contrast to Sally Rooney's writing, because obviously Rooney does use dialogue a lot to move her narrative, whereas Jackson uses atmosphere to move the narrative. So it's really nice having those differences, but also having the similarity of focusing on these character developments and looking at how these people exist around one another and interfere with each other's lives in order to grow at the same time, together and apart. And Jackson is fantastic for gothic and speculative narratives. So because I am putting quite a heavy focus on the societal view of women and girls quite a lot in the project that I'm working on, I've also been going back to some of my academic roots and reading books that have had an effect on me in the way that women are written and the way that girls are written. So it kind of very much makes sense for me to be dipping back into Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and to read Nabokov more widely as well. Obviously this is the book that everybody talks about really when they talk about Nabokov because of its place in you know, the 20th century and the literary canon that it's, you know, kind of perceived as being a part of, and also like how he as a male writer writes girls and writes women, and it's really fascinating to see that when I'm focusing on how in this century girls and women have been treated and portrayed, and how the societal change and the adaptations to how we indulge in media in the viewerage of women and girls, it's not a word, you know what I mean, and how we desire and consume women and how that is playing a role in my particular character's upbringing, her life, and how she's been raised in society. It's really important for me to look at how other writers have written girls and women over time, and Lolita is a really exceptional and satirical look at the male view, the male gaze of girls, and how in very real context the view of Humbert Humbert of Lolita has really not left society. It's if anything, it's been exaggerated and it's been made real and it's engaged with in such a terrifyingly real sense that it has affected how girls and women have grown up over the last 30 years, which is a theme that I'm particularly focused on in my writing. And also it's just like such an incredible narrative. Like it really is. I know that a lot of people see Lolita as A red flag favourite read. I'm not really sure if that just applies to when straight men read it, but I think it's really important to note that as a narrative, it is incredible. As a writing form, it's incredible. Every part of this book is so well done. It's really well crafted, from the format, the diary entries, to the overarching narrative that these are journals and passages that have been left by Humbert Humbert later in his life. So everything that we read as this narrative goes on has already happened, and it's very reflective in that. But it's also, it gives the reader this understanding and expectation that these are the writings of a man that is looking back on a time of his life that he was very indulgent in. And it's his rewriting of his past. It's his rewriting of this relationship he has with this child. And it's very fascinating how Nabokov has created this character of Humbert Humbert through his writings and through the remaining journal that, you know, is left after the end of his life. And also the almost disgusted and kind of almost hurt introduction of the keeper of these files. And even in the sense that the writing is so poetically done, you are still being reminded over and over again that you are reading the writings of a paedophile. And it's so interesting how the narrative world of Humbert Humbert is so beautiful and elegant, but the context of it and what he's writing about is so depraved. And you have to, as a reader, kind of work with that and figure out how you are responding to that. And for me in particular, that relationship between the beautiful and the depraved is a really key aspect of my own writing and how I'm interpreting society's treatment of girls. And it's really interesting kind of having that focus of my own and being able to rely on the teachings of people like Vladimir Nabokov, who wrote these narratives and wanted to expose the contradictions in a lot of the way that men view girls and women. And it's still going on today, and it's so much more violent. Or not more violent, but like there is more violence of it, you know, like women may by law have more rights and have better relationships and better access to things, but that hasn't taken away the violence of men and boys. It hasn't gone anywhere. It still happens. And I feel like, as you know, as a girl that grew up in the noughties, being aware of what my childhood was like as an adult and the experiences that I had that were like not good, it's really fascinating to be able to look back on that as an adult. So reading a narrative that is written from Humbert's future about a girl's childhood and his experiences in it, his interruption of it, is absolutely fascinating. And I really recommend it. Like I know this book is talked about a lot, but I don't think it's genuinely recommended as like an exceptional work of literature as much as it should be. So you should read Lolita. The final author that I want to talk about is, I mean, it's one that everybody knows, and it's the book that I have is so worn, like literally the foiling is almost completely gone off the front cover because of me reading it. But it's Charlotte Brontë, and this is my copy of Jane Eyre. I read Jane Eyre for the first time when I was 17. I think it was just before I went to university, and it was part of the reading list for my first year of university, so I started reading that pretty early. But I remember being intimidated by the text, mostly because up until that point, the only kind of required reading that we had at college and high school that could be seen as, you know, works of literature were Wuthering Heights. We didn't read, I don't think, age appropriate or content appropriate books at school. I think that's still something that's pretty common in the UK, that kids are they don't enjoy reading as part of literature classes. And I was a reader and I didn't enjoy my literature classes because of the content that we had to read. Like, it wasn't good for our age group. So I'd read Wuthering Heights before, but I loved Wuthering Heights because my mum gave me her copy as well. So I think that also impacted that. But it was the only book that I really remember reading in high school that could be compared, like, style-wise to this. Everything else that I read was very easy to read, very modern written. So I found Jane Eyre quite intimidating. It was probably one of the first classics that I ever read, unless you count modern classics like Holes, which I'm pretty sure we watched the film for in English rather than actually reading the book. But, you know, that happened a lot. We also watched Romeo and Juliet instead of reading the play when we were 13. So, yes, Jane Eyre, first proper classic that I ever read. It's obviously quite a hefty book. I think it's about 500 pages, but I remember the first time I read it being intimidated by it, but also really fascinated by Charlotte Bronte's writing style and the development of Jane Eyre's life and how her character grew within the first few chapters from childhood into young adulthood, and then kind of she's thrust out into this world after a very controlled upbringing. You know, she went from, as a very young child, obviously she moved in with her aunt, who was the wife of her maternal uncle after her parents died, and each chapter you kind of see her grow from this really feisty, fiery, incredible young girl to this very controlled, very quiet, very amenable young woman. And I loved reading how Charlotte Brontë wrote that, and the fieriness never truly going away, but like it was so subdued and so like patted down that it was just fascinating to see this character become a shell of herself while also trying to maintain her own individuality in a very privileged kind of life. And yeah, so I read that for my first year of uni, and then I didn't pick it up again until I think it was Christmas a few years ago. But as an author that really kind of delves into these internal monologues and atmospheric creations, it was a really fascinating book to go back to recently to explore and to understand the narrative. And Jane Eyre is actually the book that I have used as a kind of like an outline or a, oh my god, it's on the tip of my tongue. So in the preparation for writing the novel that I'm working on, I read books and then chose one to focus on as the kind of rough development outline of my own work. And the reason for that is because there is a lot that you can get out of literature as a reader. As a writer, you can look at the craft of it, the style of it, and the development of it and pick up those things. And reading a book can be just as useful as going to a writing class. And I know that probably sounds like very easy to say, but genuinely, if you read a book, you make notes about that book, and then you look back on it for inspiration, look at your notes, look at how the characters develop, how the narrative develops, how the scenes kind of blend into each other, and how they predict certain things happening later on. You make all those notes and you use that to kind of rely on for the rough outline of your own novel, of the progression of chapters. It's a really, really useful way to take inspiration without overtly stealing or relying too heavily on your inspirations. Novel developments are like, you can find novel outlines online, but I think for me, it's more useful rather than having just a generic outline with like set places for twists and turns, to look at the books that you love, the writers that you admire, and see how they're developing their stories and work towards that yourself. And Jane Eyre has a really exceptional narrative development, and the chapters are very distinct and set apart from each other in a way that can be really helpful as a writer to understand how novels are planned and structured. And that is what Jane Eyre has been for me. It's been the one that I look back to and turn to when I am trying to figure out where I want my character to turn next, which way I want the story to go. And I think that everybody should try and have a book like that for the projects that they're working on. And yeah, so that's mine. Those are my 4 authors for the project that I'm working on at the minute that I come back to again and again and read very thoroughly. So you've got Charlotte Brontë, Sally Rooney, Shirley Jackson and Vladimir Nabokov. They're all exceptional writers in their own way, but the narratives are very different and they give me something unique from each of them that I wouldn't necessarily get from the other. And I think that's a really helpful, I guess, like basket of goodies to have when working on a project, because you are getting a full experience, a full lesson from each writer that you are relying on. Really enjoying where being in these worlds is taking me in my own world and taking Project Willow. So where am I with Project Willow? I am about 50,000 words into Project Willow, which I think has very recently breached the 100-page mark in the Word document, because I work in novels in one Word document as well. I jump forward, I jump back, I use my search engine on Word like religiously. So I'm at 50,000 words of the first draft. I am an edit as I go person as well, which is obviously often advised against. But I think for me, as the story has developed and as the characters have changed and the way that they explore certain experiences has changed, I find it really helpful to go back to earlier chapters and to rewrite them as I'm going, rather than losing the ideas as they come into my head, because I won't write down notes for myself in that sense. Like I have my novel plan and my character breakdowns on Milanote. That's the website that I use to plan my novels and all of my creative projects actually. But I don't just, if I'm in the middle of writing something, I won't make a note like, oh, I need to go back and include this. I will kind of finish the bit that I'm working on, go back to the beginning and edit it in and make sure that it like lines up as I go. I've always really enjoyed writing in that way. I sometimes will just really get the urge to read a certain chapter and I will go back and do that and then edit it as I'm reading it. So there are some chapters that are more edited than others. There are some chapters that have already been through a second draft and maybe a third draft as the novel itself has been developing. I prefer to do that. I'm not recommending it for everybody. I do think there is value in getting all the words down on paper, but because I tend to live in the world that I'm writing in and I exist as those characters, for me it doesn't make a difference if I'm dipping in and out or if I'm writing 3 chapters in one go. So like this week I've written 3 chapters and the week before I was doing a little bit of revision. So I kind of like jump back and forth and it really works for me as a writer. But as well, I think it works for me because I really enjoy the editing process as well. To me, it's kind of all entwined. Editing isn't that thing that I just have to do afterwards to shorten chapters, to tweak them, to decide what's going to stay and what's going to go. It's something that happens all the time. So like if I'm writing something for chapter 11 and I realise that something in chapter 4 doesn't need to be there anymore, I will go back and take it out rather than just keeping it until I decide to do like a full second draft. And I just really enjoy having the freedom to do that. And it doesn't stop me from writing further chapters as well, which I think can be a risk of working in that way, is that once you start editing certain chapters early on, it can affect the freedom that you feel to write later chapters. So I understand that a lot of people don't like to work like that, but for me, I love to edit. I have done editorial work before and it just like, it feels really nice for me to be able to entwine that into the development of the actual writing project. And yeah, it's interesting story. It basically follows like kind of the growing up, the first 25 years or so of this one character in Project Willow, and how she responds to certain situations. And something that I find really important is actually having certain situations that mirror experiences from childhood, and seeing how she would respond differently or behave differently in later kind of episodes of that particular experience. And that's something that I'm focusing quite heavily on as I develop her as a character, is looking at how, if she is put in the same circumstances more than once, how is she handling it, and how is she behaving as a young adult compared to when she was a young child. So a lot of what happens in the story is reflective, and there's a lot of mirroring, there's a lot of repeated circumstances, and there's a lot of behaviour that becomes episodic or repetitive. And I've chosen to kind of have that as like a main point in the book, because I think that as a young woman, when you kind of exist in the same society where certain things happen to you over and over again, it's almost like you're so expectant of it that you then have to look at how do you behave differently when these things keep happening to you. It does have, I think, something that's interesting as well that I'm working on is exploring how to write sexual content, because I never really thought that I would be the kind of writer that has sexually explicit content. And it's not like just a recent thing, but just like, I think for me, like the kind of contemporary novels that I've been reading, sexual content is being developed in certain ways that is very different to how it's explored in certain genres. There are certain genres that I don't want to read sexual content in, and fantasy is one of them. I'm a big fantasy reader, but I think that the way that sex is dealt with and the way that it's explored in that genre is particularly harmful. I don't enjoy reading it. I don't like the way that it's written in certain contexts, and it doesn't feel honest or truthful. I prefer, I guess, the sexually explicit scenes that happen in contemporary novels and literary novels, because they feel more honest and more truthful. And I know that obviously like part of why romantasy is as popular as it is because it is escapist, and it is because the sexual content is written in a fantasy-esque kind of way. But just like as a reader, it's just never really appealed to me. I enjoy fantasy for its world building and its character development. I don't need or desire the sexually explicit content in the same way. Whereas I feel like often when it's used in contemporary novels, it's for its kind of plot device and plot development kind of aspects. But that's just my opinion, my preference. If you feel like you prefer the writing in fantasy rather than contemporary, let me know why that is, because I find it really interesting to hear how other readers interpret the sexually explicit content that is so like popularly used in certain writing contexts now. So yeah, those are some of the things that I'm like thinking about focusing on, and the kind of authors that I'm exploring in my research for my book in order to understand and develop the figures that I'm writing about as well. And I'm having a really good time doing it. If you are interested in hearing more about how I plan my novels and my creative projects, let me know, because it's a really big part of how I put together my work. I love planning novels and looking at how the structures are different for particular narratives, how the character involvement is different in particular circumstances. And I love fantasy, but I don't have a current fantasy project on the go. All of the stories that I'm exploring are contemporary or literary, however you want to describe it. So I'd be quite interested to talk to some more people about how different writers do that. So yeah. that is kind of like my first update on Project Willow and how it's developing, what it looks like, and how I, as a writer, am engaging with it. So yeah, if you have any advice or any particular writing tips that you'd like to share with me, please do, because I'm always interested in kind of the process of writing in itself and how that is different for each person. I love to try different techniques in order to like keep myself writing. One that I've been using this month, maybe the past month and a half, that has really spurred me on is journaling. The act of writing, not particularly, you know, the planning of the actual novel, but like giving myself space to journal and to write and to create from nothing. Yeah, thank you for listening along and learning more about Project Willow, my current novel writing project that I'm working on. And yeah, if you want to know more, if you have any questions, please let me know. I would love to answer some questions, and stick around to find out more about what I'm doing in my studio, my career, my projects, all of those things. Bye!